True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Christian Michael Longo was married at age 19, and he was the father of 3 by the time he was 26. Originally from Michigan and raised as a Jehovah's Witness, Longo did not adapt well to his life as a husband and father. His wife MaryJane stayed home with their children, while Longo was expected to provide for their family, but he quickly turned to a life of crime. After getting into trouble for check fraud, Longo took his family on the run in a stolen minivan, but after promising to turn over a new leaf, he continued to steal and to scam for money. The Longo family moved from Michigan to Ohio to Oregon. Then their 4-year-old son Zachary and 3-year-old daughter Sadie were found dead in the waters of Lint Slough. The bodies of MaryJane and their infant daughter Madison were recovered just days later. Join us at the quiet end today for the story of a young family destroyed by the evil acts of compulsive liar and manipulator Christian Longo. The lives of this young family started out with hopes and aspirations, but ended in tragedy and despair. The only one left to explain what happened was the one who could never be trusted or believed. But we can debate causations and examine missed opportunities in our efforts to understand these murders of MaryJane, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison Longo.
Okay, so I did an Oregon beer for this, and I did one of the breweries you really like because they make a bunch of wild ales. This is Cascade Brewing, and we're going to have some Cascade Blueberry Ale. Nice beer. Deep reddish purple color, pinkish head. Don't see too many foamy pink heads, do you?
No, but I'm going to have to be honest here and say that I have had this beer and I did enjoy it.
I know you have.
Well, I'm telling our listeners.
Okay. It's got a nice earthy blueberry aroma, a tart blueberry taste, a little bit of that earthy funk in there, and it's a dry beer with a subtle tartness. Nice beer. Cascade makes a lot of nice wild ales. The problem is they're rather expensive.
They are pricey, but they're great for a special occasion for someone you love.
Well, that's why we got it.
Right.
What could be more special than to have a beer with you?
I can't think of anything more special than having a beer with you.
There we are. See?
All right.
So we'll open these beers up and we'll head on down to our friends at the quiet end.
Sounds good. All right, follow me down to the quiet end and we'll enjoy this beer. And share it, of course.
We will. We'll share it with ourselves and we'll share it with the rest of the folks down here.
That's right. So why don't you start out our story today? I mean, I'm going to say it's a difficult one, but there's also a lot to learn from it. It's kind of an amazing, remarkable tale.
There are some things to learn.
Very tragic, of course.
But I think to understand the lives of the family, we might need to have some basic background knowledge of the beliefs and practices of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, I think that helps because that is a part of the story.
It's a large part. So Jehovah's Witnesses was founded in 1879 by a Pennsylvania businessman named Charles Russell. Russell believed that the second coming of Christ would occur in 1914. So Jehovah's Witnesses emphasize the coming end of the world. They reject blood transfusions because of the New Testament command to abstain from blood, and they don't vote, and they don't serve in the military. They also don't celebrate any traditional Christian holidays, and they don't celebrate birthdays. I remember before I started learning anything about Jehovah's, way back at the beginning of my career, I had a little boy in the office, and I noticed from his chart that his birthday was the next day. So I said to him, "Happy birthday." He looked at me, his mother says, "We're Jehovah's Witnesses, we don't celebrate birthdays."
So you can't even say happy birthday, though?
Well, she was a pretty conservative witness.
I guess she was very staunch. I don't know. It's just hard for kids like that to not be able to celebrate what other kids are celebrating.
Well, and they ran into some of those difficulties with interactions with other people and families that weren't Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's difficult for the kids, and it was definitely an influence on Christian Longo's childhood that, followed him into adulthood.
That's right. So Christian Michael Longo was born in 1974 in Iowa. He was adopted as a child by Joseph Longo, who married Chris's mother Joy in the late 70s. The biologic father divorced his wife, right?
They didn't stay together, yeah.
Yeah, right. So this year, 1974, was an important one for Jehovah's Witnesses, because many of them expected Armageddon to happen in 1975.
Right, so 1914 didn't happen, obviously, and they came up with a reason for that. I'm not sure what the reason was then. When the world didn't end in 1975, they also said, well, we can't predict it exactly, but the world is going to end. So it's hard when you're calling for the end of the world and then that time passes.
Yeah, you've got to come up with some reason.
Right, so I think it makes people very skeptical, and rightly so.
So in the 1975 terminus, which is what some witnesses called the potential event, was based on the analysis of Watchtower Society biblical experts, who said that the year 1975 would mark the end of God's day of rest. So they reasoned because God could be expected to go back to work once his day of rest was over, what was going to happen to end the world could be expected to happen before the end of 1975.
Yes, it's a very complicated way that they were figuring that out.
It is.
Which I don't think is that relevant to go into. Just as long as you know that, I think you're on board with what would have been going on in the minds of people who were Jehovah's at this time.
To an extent.
So Chris was Joy's first child, and Joy was a teenager. She was actually a teenage bride of an abusive husband. According to Joy, when she was pregnant with her second child, Chris's younger brother Justin, her husband beat her in her abdomen with a chain, trying to induce an abortion. According to a psychologist, Dr. Stephen Scher, who would later evaluate Chris, the violence in his childhood destroyed his sense of self-worth. This meant that after he became an adult, Chris sought out the approval of other people in order to maintain his self-esteem. So Chris lied and he stole in order to get approval.
Yeah, I don't know, that just seems like a simplistic explanation for how this guy acted and behaved.
Well, I certainly don't think that's the whole story, but it's something.
It can't be the whole story.
No, of course not. It's never one thing that affects a person or makes someone who they are.
Well, Dr. Scher thinks it is.
Well, I don't know if it was that simplistic, but that was one of his things that he brought up.
Yeah.
So Joy divorced Chris's father when Chris was just about 4 years old. Then she met Joe Longo in a store where she was working. Joe was athletic. He'd been a star wide receiver on the Morningside College football team in Sioux City. Until he was about 10 years old, Chris's family was Roman Catholic. In the 1980s, Joe Longo became a district manager for a chain of retail stores, and then he began to earn a good middle-class salary. The family was financially comfortable, and Chris got what he needed from his parents, and seemed to be having a happy childhood at that point.
Yeah, but then one day, some Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on the Longo's door. Joy let them in, and she became quickly interested in the faith. So she began attending meetings, and when she went to the meeting, she would take Chris and his younger brother along with her. So Chris and his brother became involved in field service activity with Joy. By this I mean that they would spend hours going door to door to try to convert people into the Jehovah's Witness religion.
Now, I don't know how big of a thing that is now, but it was certainly a big thing where and when I grew up. We had Jehovah's Witnesses coming to our door at least a couple times a week.
Well, you were in a hot spot. I mean, we had them at times, but it wasn't that frequent.
Well, I did grow up in Michigan. Not that far, actually, from where the Longos lived.
Yeah,
so that might be it.
You might have been in a hot spot.
Yeah, but you know what was funny is that when my older sister became a teenager, she would purposely let the Jehovah's in and give them tea and talk to them, just to irritate my mother. Because when they came by and it was my mother home, she would have us hide and draw the curtains, because she didn't want to have to talk to them. So it would just kind of become a game when I'd come home from school. If these people were there, My sister would be entertaining them until my mom came home from work.
Oh,
and
boy.
then after they finally went home, because everyone was polite in front of them, my sister and my mother would have it out.
I would have loved to hear that discussion.
It was kind of fun, yeah. So Chris and his brother became involved in this activity, and this meant that they would spend hours going door to door. Chris was smart and really socially comfortable, so it didn't take long before he was a speaker at the meetings, and he began talking to people about his faith. He really became something of a religious prodigy with his excellent public speaking ability. And from the young age of 11, he'd be called up to do a Bible reading and to explain Bible verses at their Kingdom Hall, which is their church.
Right. Yeah, so Chris had definitely the gift of gab.
Yes, he could really charm people and convince people of almost anything.
He could. And we'll see as we talk later about his crimes, how facile he was with his language and how he could talk people out of things or into things.
Really quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Yes. For someone who really didn't even have a high school education.
Right.
He did have a gift.
So eventually, stepfather Joe Longo also joined the witnesses. And as the Longo family became more involved with the witnesses, Chris and his brother began to have very limited contact with children who were not witnesses.
So that's the problem. It can become very isolating.
It sure can.
The other kids in school were known as worldly people, and Chris was discouraged from hanging around with them. He could only talk on the phone with non-witnesses if it was about schoolwork, and the kids couldn't go to birthday parties or sleepovers. Additionally, extracurricular activities were discouraged because of that time taken away from their works for God, such as the door-to-door stuff. So after he reached his teens, Chris had revealed this real impulsive streak. He was actively breaking the rules of the witness community. This came as a bit of a shock because he'd been such a good witness. Joy and Joe were worried that he was becoming too worldly, so his parents removed him from the public high school. But he was a bright kid. After he rebelled, he was quick to apologize and to promise to change his ways. So he never really got into deep trouble. He was able to talk himself out of it.
Yeah, but I'm also looking at this as, while he identified as a Jehovah's Witness, he certainly wasn't following all their beliefs and tenets.
No, there were things going on inside of him that other people didn't know about clearly, because his behavior from a fairly young age was not what it should have been, and there was a lot of secrecy and lying going on.
Exactly. So Chris did like technology and photography. Now these are things seen by witnesses as worldly things. During his high school years, Chris hacked into the school's computer in order to change his grades. So after this event, some people said he was expelled from school. Other people said that his parents removed him from the school.
Yeah, well, why he was removed doesn't really matter, because from that point forward, he was homeschooled. And no offense to Joy, but she really wasn't a teacher. It's really hard to homeschool a child if you haven't gone through college yourself, or at least some kind of classes to be a teacher. So I would just have to say that I bet that was lacking a bit.
Well, I think that that's the time that his education really stopped. I don't think he did much homeschooling.
No, I think most of the homeschooling was religious-based.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think he was reading the classics. I don't think he was learning a lot of math. I think he was probably learning more and more about being a witness. Now, he did want to go door to door because it was seen as a privilege as well as a responsibility. And if that privilege was taken away from him, that would be upsetting. It would be a bad thing for him.
Now, when he was 16, Joe Longo was transferred to Ann Arbor, Michigan, for his job. So Joe and Joy bought a farmhouse in the country, which was just south of Ypsilanti. The family became members of the witness congregation in town. Now, Chris didn't go to school. He was homeschooled, remember. He did go to work in minimum wage jobs while continuing his alleged homeschooling and his door-to-door field service work.
Yeah, it's really sad that college really wasn't even presented to him as a possibility. He never did receive a high school diploma, which can really hold you back in the real world. Chris had never been on a date. He'd never attended a high school dance. so he hadn't gone through the normal things that teenagers go through. All of his socialization was through the Kingdom Hall. So it was at the Kingdom Hall where Chris met MaryJane Baker, his future wife.
Now, MaryJane was born in 1967, and she is the third child of Susan and Jim Baker. When she was 6 years old, her parents divorced. And about the same time as the divorce, Mother Susan became a Jehovah's Witness. Father Jim rejected the witnesses, but the children lived with their mother and all were raised in the witness faith. Later down the road, 3 of MaryJane's siblings left the Jehovah's Witness faith.
Right, which isn't unusual.
No, there is some turnover.
There absolutely is. But MaryJane was smart, very hardworking, and an excellent student. But her greatest ambition, probably because of the way she was raised, was to get married and just have her own family. By 1992, MaryJane had graduated from high school in Ann Arbor, and she worked as a secretary in several pediatric offices. She eventually ended up taking a job as a secretary at the dental school at the University of Michigan. It was a good job, and it paid well. MaryJane was really good at it, but she still wanted a husband. And her choices of men were unfortunately limited to the Jehovah's Witnesses that she knew. So one that she did take notice of would be Christian Longo. MaryJane was 25 years old, but Christian was only 18 years old. So that's a pretty wide age difference when you're that young. It's not like she's 40 and he's 33 or whatever.
Well, there's that. Plus, he has no experience with women.
No,
other than his mother.
Right, right.
But socially, he was really immature.
And you do a lot of growing in those 7 years. Most people do.
You certainly do.
But as soon as Chris found out that MaryJane might be interested in him, he went to his parents and he told them that he wanted to date her. And this is what he was supposed to do. He was doing what his parents wanted him to do. But they told him that he wasn't mature enough to date yet. But he's 18. The hormones are raging. And after he persisted, they told him, well, you can't date as long as you're living under our roof.
Yeah, the old ultimatum.
So that kind of pushed him out of the house. Sent things in a worse direction.
Yeah, so he found a job working in an Ann Arbor camera store, saved up some money, and then he and 2 other witness boys rented an apartment in Ann Arbor. So once he was in his own place, he and MaryJane began to date.
Yeah, even though he was so young, he did make a really good impression with MaryJane's family. He dressed well, he appeared well off, but everything he had was from his father. He was really still a boy. Although his public speaking skills really helped him to give the impression that he was more mature and successful than he really was. He was actually very immature, and he was undereducated. But because of MaryJane's faith, she believed that Chris would be her male spiritual authority. So if she was to be with him, she would follow his lead in life. He would be in charge. Since she was also opposed to divorce, especially since her parents had divorced, her marriage to Chris was a lifelong commitment in her eyes. She was going to stick with him.
Well, that's how the Jehovah's Witnesses view marriage.
Yes, but she also had this personal determination not to get a divorce.
Yeah, well, she comes from a divorced family.
And this would in many ways be her undoing.
Yes, that's definitely true.
So when Chris decided to propose, he visited a jewelry store near the camera store where he was working, and he bought a diamond engagement ring for MaryJane on credit. The price was about $3,000, so he would barely be able to make the monthly payments on his salary. That's an expensive ring for someone in his age and position.
Jeez, don't get me going.
Well, just a few months after buying the ring, Chris's car died, and he needed a new car. Then one of his roommates stopped paying his rent on time, and the lease was in Chris's name, so he was responsible. Then one day, just a short time before the wedding, Chris decided to steal from the camera store's cash register. Then he made a payment on the ring with that stolen money. The next day, his manager noticed this missing cash. He confronted all of the employees, and Chris didn't admit to the theft. But then he left a check on the store counter the next day, along with his letter of resignation, basically admitting he'd taken that money.
Right, but after he did that, he didn't have the money to pay for his share of the rent. And he told his two roommates what had happened. As we said, they're both witnesses, so what do? They turned around and report Chris to the church elders. So, and after that, Chris had to forfeit his membership in the congregation, which meant a big loss of status. And it also meant that he and MaryJane weren't going to be allowed to get married in the Kingdom Hall.
Yeah, so Chris had a meeting with the elders, and they decided to remove his privileges, also withholding permission for the ceremony to take place in the Kingdom Hall. But they agreed that he could be married by an official of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Chris had to promise the elders and MaryJane that he would straighten up, and that's what he did. But the camera store manager had already called the police, and a warrant was issued for Chris's arrest. But MaryJane wouldn't find out about this arrest warrant until years later. He kept that hidden. So he's really not straightening up or following his faith.
No, he sure isn't.
I mean, to him it seemed like it was more about how things looked and what appearances were. He didn't seem to really care what was really happening at all. I mean, almost in a very sick way.
Well, appearance is everything with him.
Yes, exactly.
So he's got to have the best of this, the best of that, eat the best food, have the best clothes, you know.
Well, yeah, that's part of his low self-esteem I was talking about earlier.
Yep.
So Chris and MaryJane went ahead with their wedding, and they found a nice apartment to live in. Then they bought a lot of expensive furniture. Chris even installed a pool table and a wet bar. So he seemed like a successful entrepreneur, and he acted quite worldly. The landlord thought that Chris must have come from money, but he was actually spending money he didn't have, and he and MaryJane were living way beyond their means. Chris was sued many times for failing to pay people money he owed them. He'd opened a charge account at a department store, and 6 months later, both Chris and MaryJane were sued by the department store for failure to make payments on 3 accounts. And these were charges totaling nearly $1,500. That's not a small amount of money.
No, it's just...
It's a large amount of their income.
He really never had much solvency, did he?
No.
He worked low-paying jobs, but he figured he should be spending money.
Yeah, some of the times when he spent money is just unbelievable. He would just go out and buy frivolous things.
Yep.
Just to the point of, like I said, it was like a sickness.
So besides these other difficulties, financial difficulties, he had driving difficulties. Chris had at least 7 different traffic infractions between 1992 and 1996, including one for driving with a suspended license. Now, he was arrested in 1992 for misdemeanor embezzlement. And from court records, it looked like MaryJane had bailed Chris out financially more than once.
Yeah, he actually worked as a distributor for the New York Times, basically supervising the paper boys in the local region. And by the late 1990s, Chris had become a Midwestern manager for the company. But that wasn't good enough. He had to tell people that he worked for the Times rather than this distributing company, because it sounded more impressive to say that.
Well, wouldn't it?
Well, of course it would, but why did he have this compulsion to say it?
Yep.
And through this whole thing, it's really hard to tell how much MaryJane knew.
Yes, it is. I mean, I'm always of the impression that she knew more than she let on, or that people recognized.
It's possible, but we do have to remember she was probably quite naive herself, and he was a good liar. I mean, if he could trick policemen and judges and parole officers and all kinds of people, then it's really not surprising that he could fool MaryJane.
Yeah, I'll grant that, but okay. I still think she was more aware than she let on.
Okay, well, I don't know what you mean by let on. I mean, she wasn't talking to anyone about it, whether she was aware or not. It's not something she would be comfortable sharing.
Well, it wouldn't be.
No.
But she didn't confront her husband with any of this.
Well, I bet she did confront him. I think a lot of this was kept between the two of them.
Okay, then she was more aware of things.
She may have been, yep. I'm just saying she wouldn't have let on anyway.
Well, she wouldn't have talked to outsiders, that's for sure.
No, not at all. So for the first few years of their marriage, Chris and MaryJane seemed to be doing quite well. And again, we don't know what MaryJane thought. If she thought they were doing well, if there were arguments at home, we don't really know. But they were both working, and they took trips and went out to dinners with friends. So maybe it was more manageable when they had no children and she was working. I would imagine things were easier then.
Oh, for sure.
But they were spending so much that MaryJane's family really had to wonder where all the money was coming from. They wondered if Chris's parents were giving them money, but actually they weren't. Chris and MaryJane were actually deeply in debt, and they weren't paying their bills on time, if paying them at all.
Right.
Now remember, though, MaryJane was raised to let the man handle everything,
Well,
right?
yes, he's going to take care of everything.
So if he says the bills are being paid, she's supposed to believe that, whether deep down she feels like she can or not.
Yeah, I know. Now, in the midst of all this financial difficulties, MaryJane gets pregnant, and their first child, Zachary, was born in 1997. So she's 29, Chris is 23. Then she quickly became pregnant again, and the couple decided to buy a house. So they bought a small house in Ypsilanti from MaryJane's mother and stepfather, who had agreed to sell the house on a land sale contract for a total of $70,000.
Yeah, and I think that was a pretty good deal they gave them. They were helping them out.
It was a sweetheart deal, for sure.
Yeah.
So just shortly after they moved into the house, MaryJane gave birth to Sadie. And at this point, she left her job so that she could be at home and raise her children. Now, MaryJane said that the cost of childcare would take up too much of her income. But at the same time, as a devout Jehovah's Witness, MaryJane saw her role in life as a mother. And she didn't want someone else to raise her children. And I think that'd be the overriding reason why she stayed home.
Sure, I would think so. Although if you're not making a lot of money, childcare can kind of just cancel out what you're earning. That can certainly happen as well.
Right.
So now earning the money was Chris's job. And he did want MaryJane to quit her job, and he wanted to be the sole provider because that's how he was raised to want to be. But he clearly wasn't earning enough money to maintain the lifestyle that he wanted. Not at all.
Not anywhere close.
Now, the pregnancy with Sadie was an unplanned pregnancy. And according to Chris, MaryJane had just returned from the hospital after giving birth when the newspaper distribution company called and told him he had to fly to San Francisco immediately. The company told him that the distribution workers in the Bay Area were about to go on strike. So he flew out and spent a week in San Francisco. The company wanted him to stay on for a longer period, according to Chris, but he decided to quit. So, of course, this is Chris's version of what happened. And if it's true, he had thrown away a job that paid well and also was providing the insurance benefits for the family, which are very important when you have babies.
We know that.
So it didn't seem to be the best decision.
Nope, but he was done with them.
So we don't even know if that's what happened, though. There could have been a theft.
Well,
he could have gotten fired. There could be a lot more to it.
Chris's version.
Exactly.
So then he took a job as a salesman for a company that sold fireplaces and spas to home building contractors. It was a job that paid quite a bit less than his previous job at the newspaper. He said later that the company had promised to pay him even more than what he had been earning with the distributors, but then the company was bought out by another firm, and Chris's pay was cut even more.
Yeah, so things are going downhill.
So we got 2 kids, we got no job for either of them. And by this time, he and MaryJane had at least 14 different credit cards, and they were all maxed out. So they were missing payments, and Chris should have been pretty desperate, but you wouldn't know it from how he continued to spend money.
Yeah, this is the part that just loses me on why you would do this. You know, just to keep up the lifestyle. And he had to resort to stealing. It's the only way he could do it.
Yeah, and no matter what job he had, he wasn't going to be able to make enough money to do the things he wanted to do in life.
Or even dig him out of the hole.
No, well, it's going to go out as fast as it comes in.
Exactly. So he started writing bad checks to MaryJane's mother and stepfather for their house payments. And not wanting to upset MaryJane, her mother didn't say anything to her. She went directly to Chris. They threatened to foreclose on the house if Chris didn't catch up with the payments.
Yeah, so MaryJane found out what was going on and was deeply embarrassed. So she promised her mother that she and Chris would make good on the payments as soon as they could.
Well, oddly, Chris didn't seem very concerned about these financial obligations to his in-laws. He used whatever money he earned to buy frivolous things still. He told MaryJane's sisters that he had a job working as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. So wow, that's a big step up out of nowhere.
Isn't it?
For someone who hasn't finished high school. So they knew that Chris always seemed to have a lot of money, though. And he traveled a lot. So they began to wonder if Chris was a complete fraud. And they began to worry about their sister, MaryJane. Like, what has she gotten herself into with this guy? He seemed impressive at first, but now things just aren't adding up. They have 2 children. We're worried about our sister.
Rightly so. Now, here's just another example of how Chris approached things, right?
Okay, sure.
In December of 1998, and this is like less than a year after Sadie had been born, he and his wife, MaryJane, borrowed $3,500. And with that, they bought a jet ski, which came to a monthly payment of $160. All this while they were deeply over their heads in debt.
Yeah, so that makes no sense at all, does it?
It doesn't. So Chris and MaryJane signed the loan papers, but it's a little bit unclear how much MaryJane actually knew about their financial situation.
Right, so did he give her some kind of a story to get her to sign? Like, we're going to buy it for this amount and we're going to sell it and make more money?
Yeah,
Maybe
probably.
He sold it for cash and then just stopped making the payments. That would be something he would have done.
That'd be, yeah. Well, and then a week later, they leased a brand new Dodge Durango from a dealer, and the lease payments on this car were $400 a month. And Chris even splurged on a vanity plate, which said Skyview. Then, 2 months later, in February 1999, MaryJane got pregnant for the 3rd time.
Yeah, so Madison Longo was born in October of 1999, and Chris did manage to pay off his in-laws. But in order to do it, he had to take out a high-interest loan and lose all of the equity in the house. Meanwhile, MaryJane's car was repossessed, and Chris was continuing to get traffic tickets, which aren't cheap.
No, they aren't. And the funny thing about them is the more you get, the more they cost.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And then you end up getting your license suspended. It's a bad road to travel, no pun intended. But in February of 2000, he walked into a Pontiac dealership and he introduced himself as Jason Joseph Fortner. He went up to a sales associate who was busy with another client and asked if he could take a new Montana minivan for a test drive. He said he just wanted to show his wife the van before he bought it. So the sales associate made a photocopy of the license that he gave her, and she gave him the keys for the van. This was about 2:30 in the afternoon. So Fortner drove the red van off the lot, and it was never returned. Now this was a van with everything. It was worth nearly $34,000. And the stolen van ended up in the driveway of the Longo home in Ypsilanti. Chris removed the Skyview personalized license plate from their leased Durango and put it on the van. Then he was able to go to the Michigan DMV and get a new vanity plate, Kid Van, to put on the stolen car. So this was amazing to me that someone could do this.
It is. Well, some of this is particular to Michigan.
Yeah, it is.
So in this state, at least at the time, vanity plates do not refer directly to the registered owner, but only the legal owner. So the Kid Van plate only listed the leasing company of the Durango as the owner. Now to figure out the scam that's going on, they would have needed the VIN number.
Right, and they didn't ask for it.
Nope.
But the Montana theft was not the end of Chris's crimes, oh no. In early 2000, Chris organized a new business, getting his mother Joy and stepfather Joe to invest, along with some other Jehovah's Witnesses. The new company was Final Touch Construction Cleaning, a company made to clean newly constructed homes before the owners moved in. Joy and Joe Longo guaranteed the company a $100,000 line of credit. So Chris had convinced them that it was a good investment somehow.
So it's hard to say if Chris started this business with the intention of stealing money from people, but that's how things ended up.
Absolutely.
He wrote a large business check on the Final Touch Construction Cleaning account in order to buy a trailer and forklift from a business called Saline Tractor Equipment in Ypsilanti. The check bounced. So the owner of Saline Tractor made several attempts to contact Chris to put funds in the bank to cover the check, but it got repeatedly rejected for insufficient funds.
Right. Then he also hired workers from a temp agency, and he was unable to pay them. Next, he took a $5,900 final touch business check to a credit union, deposited it, and then took the money out, which I'm surprised they let him do that. But I guess he was able to just come across as a legitimate businessman, is all I can think.
Well, apparently.
But during this time, he and MaryJane were in default on their jet ski loan. Then Chris sold the trailer and forklift that he'd bought with a bad check from Saline Tractor for $5,000 cash. Saline Tractor called the police after they didn't get their money and they couldn't get the equipment returned to them. But Chris lied and told them that the trailer had been totaled in an accident. He claimed that none of these financial problems would have happened if this company, Wexford Builders, his main client, had paid him what they owed him. He was simply having a cash flow problem, and it's the only way he knew how to fix it.
Yeah, so his story is that if only his chief business client was paying him in a timely fashion, which they had always been doing, but he was in a cash-poor time. So what do you do?
Well, you start faking checks, I guess.
Let's kite some checks here.
He seemed to act like that was just the next logical step.
I know. It's just amazing to me.
It was very amazing to the detectives who spoke with him about it. Because things were getting worse and Chris was just digging himself deeper and deeper into trouble. He copied 6 checks from Wexford Builders and made them out to himself for between $2,700 and $4,700 per check. And these forged checks would total around $30,000. He took them to banks and got cashier's checks payable to him personally. And along with these bad checks he deposited at the credit union and the $5,000 he had stolen from the equipment dealers, he'd actually scammed more than $40,000 in cash within 3 weeks. And when he was done, he told MaryJane, "Hey, we're going to go on a family vacation."
Yeah, so who cares about making things right with the creditors?
Not Chris.
Let's go.
Yes.
We deserve this vacation.
That's how he thought. And I don't think she really knew about any of that.
Well, I guess not, because she would have, I think, made more of an issue about it.
She would have been horrified. I mean, according to her family, this wouldn't have been okay with her in any way. So he was fooling her just as he was fooling a lot of people.
So the Longo family went on a trip to northern Michigan. That's what all you guys do from down in the Detroit, Ann Arbor area.
Well, it's the cheapest trip to do. And it's pretty up there.
You go to the UP?
Sometimes, but that's pretty far. Sometimes Mackinac Island, Traverse City. Those are quicker trips.
And when they got back from their vacation, strange of strangeness, they were somehow out of money.
Yeah, so where did it all go? Chris walked into a bank with a briefcase and a daily planner, looking like a businessman. Then he gave a cashier's check to a teller to cash. But the teller remembered Chris. A detective had questioned her just days earlier about an earlier fraudulent check to Final Touch Construction Cleaning.
Yeah, so Chris is so bright. He goes to a bank that he'd already cashed a stolen check from.
To the same teller.
To the same teller.
Right.
Duh.
Yeah. Well, the teller acted cool and reported Chris to her supervisor. But before the police could get there, he did get suspicious and took off. But he left behind his briefcase, his planner, and his driver's license. Plus, people at the bank had gotten a good look at the van and the vanity plate. So there was nothing smooth about this.
Nope. Clumsy, actually.
Very. And I just don't understand why he needed more money.
I get the impression that there was never enough money for Mr. Longo.
I think you're right, yep.
The Michigan State Police had a warrant out for Longo's arrest, and they had a search warrant for the Longo home. Now, they'd been waiting for him to return from vacation. So Chris comes home with the family. He's arrested while he's sitting in the van with MaryJane and the kids. He's taken to the police station, got questioned about the fraudulent checks. Now, this is serious because each check, each count, could mean up to 14 years in prison for Chris.
Yeah, but he just didn't seem to get it or care. It was very strange.
Yeah, he was very calm, very laid back. It's like he was just talking about some business matter.
Right, that's how it's described.
Yeah, according to him, well, it's just like a temporary shortage of cash flow, and I tried to fix it this way.
Right. He said it was really Wexford Builders' fault because they hadn't paid him all the money he owed him.
That's
So
right. That's
he's
the way
very
to do
good
it.
at explaining these things away, at least in his own mind.
Those other guys did it. So Chris agreed to let police search for the computer and papers connected to the fraudulent checks he had created. So MaryJane came down to the police station in the East Durango instead of the Montana. And you could take that to mean that she might have known that the Montana was a stolen car.
Well, yeah, I have a hard time believing that she hadn't figured that out. Maybe she didn't know when he did it, but she had to have figured that out. They had 2 very nice cars, which would have had high payments.
Yep.
Now, police took Chris's laptop plus some bank receipts from the checks that Chris had cashed. Then they allowed Chris to go home with MaryJane, which just makes me want to slap my forehead. What? Why did they do that? The detectives would admit that they had sufficient evidence to keep Chris and put him in jail. He would have been arraigned the next day. But since he had a wife, children, and a business, police believed that Chris wouldn't flee, and they let him go home on his own recognizances, which is just one of the mistakes I believe the authorities made that led to this tragedy, or at least allowed it to happen, didn't stop it.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see letting him go.
Can you really?
Yeah.
I can't.
I mean, it's
These
just...
are major crimes. This isn't like shoplifting.
I know that, but it's just money. He hadn't killed anybody.
Well, sure, I'm not saying he should get the death penalty for that, but you can't keep him in jail overnight and do some more searches on what's going on, because there are more things. Wouldn't you search his cars and make sure that they're legitimate and not stolen?
Yes, I would definitely think that they needed to investigate a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just think it was a mistake to do that. And the mistakes get worse later on, so we'll see what you think then.
They just compound.
Right, right.
So Chris gets arrested with 2 separate charges possible for each of the 7 checks. One was forgery of the authorized signer's name, and the second charge was uttering and publishing the false check. So he's got a lot of stuff coming against him.
Yeah, MaryJane talked to her sisters, and she told them that Chris was really sorry and humiliated by this arrest. But actually he was very lucky. The police could have checked the VIN number of the Montana and figured out it was stolen. They also could have looked into the scam he had run with saline tractor equipment and 3D merchandise brokers with the equipment that he had bought on a bad check and sold and taken cash. So it's almost like he robbed twice with that, right?
Right.
It was a double robbery or a double fraud. So he could have been charged for that if they looked into any of that. There was also a bad check he'd written on the overdrawn business account of Final Touch Construction Cleaning. He'd written that out to a credit union. So he really could have been in jail for quite a long time with a bail that he couldn't pay. But the police only knew of some of these crimes in this 6-week crime spree that had happened. And Chris had not even paid up his overdrawn business account. So even though he'd stolen $40,000, he didn't even bother to pay off a couple thousand to put his business account right.
Yeah, I mean, it almost looks like all the money he had went to his and his family's entertainment.
It did. He didn't pay any bills off. He had all those credit cards. He had a lot of things that he could have tried to make good on at least, but he didn't even do that. Now he was already in default on the monthly payments for the Dodge Durango as well as the jet ski. He had paid off his in-laws for the house, but because the money he stole was taken in cash, there was no proof of what he had done with all that cash. So he'd stolen the cash. He had paid off his in-laws, but he'd also taken a loan for that. So we really don't know where the cash came from.
Cash had nothing to do with paying off the in-laws, did it?
No, I don't think so.
And he allegedly paid off his workers at Final Touch, but most of their checks bounced.
Yes.
So he wasn't paying them either.
No, and there were people in the witnesses, friends of the family and whatnot, that had worked for him that he never paid. And there were lawsuits filed against him and MaryJane. But still, he seemed short on money.
Yeah.
He actually tried to forge a 7th check on the day of his arrest, less than 3 weeks after he completed his other schemes. So it's possible he had spent some of this money on a girlfriend. Because yes, in 2000, Chris was having an affair with another woman. And she was also a Jehovah's Witness. According to MaryJane's siblings, she had found out about the affair when she found emails between Chris and his lover on his computer.
Yeah, and this is Chris's fault. because MaryJane asked to learn how to use the computer, and he said, "Here, I'll show you how," on his computer. So it's like he's almost inviting her to find the evidence for the affair.
Yeah, well, maybe he wanted her to find out.
So MaryJane confronted him. Chris did admit to an emotional affair, claiming that there had been no sex. Yeah, right.
Yeah, we never believed that. And for his part, Chris turned all the blame on MaryJane, telling her that she spent too much time with their children and she was neglecting his needs.
Yeah, a man's got needs, you know.
I know, right?
Okay, so why don't we stop here so you can do some sponsor stuff?
Okay. You can take coloring your hair at home to the next level with guess who? Madison Reed. Madison Reed gives you gorgeous professional hair color delivered to your door for less than $25. Madison Reed hair color is one of a kind because it's multidimensional and gives you your choice of over 45 multitonal shades that have been developed by master colorists who really know how to blend nuances of cool, warm, light, and dark shades. Many of our listeners have written to me to tell me how Madison Reed hair color has improved their lives, and I totally get it. It's a small thing, but it's definitely significant. Madison Reed delivers gray-covering, natural-looking hair color to my door, and only when I want it. Now I'm free from salon visits, and I'm saving money, while my hair looks and feels better than ever. It's soft, strong, and very natural-looking, giving me one less thing to worry about. So, of course, I'm happy to recommend Madison Reed to our listeners. It's affordable, it's convenient, and it's very high quality. We're busy women. Don't we deserve gorgeous professional hair color delivered to our doors on our schedule for less than $25? Of course we do. Find your perfect shade at madison-reed.com. True Crime Brewery listeners get 10% off plus free shipping on their first color kit, too, by using our code BREWERY. That's code BREWERY at madison-reed.com.
So following his arrest for the check fraud, in August of 2000, Chris was formally disfellowshipped by the Jehovah's Witnesses Church. Now, by then his standing was already so badly damaged that there wasn't anywhere really to go anyway. One thing, he had written bad checks to several witnesses who worked for him for final touch. So, like we said, I don't know, who knows where that money was going. It wasn't going to any of the parties that he owed money to.
Not really, no. And this was all just humiliating for poor MaryJane.
Oh, no kidding. I mean, the shunning didn't extend to her or the kids, but she's in a kind of an impossible situation, you know?
Sure.
I mean, she can't cut off contact with her own husband, which is what you're supposed to do.
Well, yeah, but you're not supposed to get a divorce, so she's really in a catch-22 situation.
Isn't she?
And divorce was not an option to her, at least the way she saw it.
No. And she continued to go to meetings, and she tried to be strong in the face of what must have been just horribly severe embarrassment.
Right, yeah.
And I don't know that I could show my face around that church.
It would be tough. And it was important to her, let's remember. This was her support system. This was very important to her. On September 21st of 2000, Chris pled guilty to 2 counts of forgery and 2 counts of uttering and publishing. He reached a plea deal and managed to avoid any jail time at all, though. This is so hard for me to believe. I mean, considering the amount of fraud he committed and the amount of money that he had stolen from a bank.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
But it's a good deal. Maybe you could call it a sweetheart deal or something, right?
He got a lot of those, too many. You know, he did have some things going for him, but mainly it was his family. People felt bad for his family. The prosecution really didn't take imprisoning a father of 3 for a white-collar crime lightly. The plea deal was 3 years probation, a $500 fine, $1,900 in costs, nearly $30,000 in restitution, and 80 hours of community service. And Chris agreed to repay the bank $900 a month. But there's just no way that he was going to be able to do that. He couldn't afford it.
Yeah, no, this whole plea bargain is doomed from the beginning.
Yeah, I don't know who made him that deal, because he really wasn't working at all at that point.
No, I mean, it sounds good that he managed to escape jail time. Great. But he's got virtually impossible restrictions on what it can do.
So were they really doing him a favor giving him this deal? Maybe it would have been better for him to be in jail and getting some kind of therapy. And maybe it would have been good for MaryJane to have him away for a while. Maybe she would have realized she was better off without him. So I guess they were trying to help out the family by giving him this deal, but it wasn't going to work out.
No, and it certainly wasn't going to help the family.
No, it wasn't. So as part of his probation agreement, Chris had to visit a probation officer once a month, which is the normal thing. His probation officer, Michael Longo, was to be notified by Chris if there were any changes in his living or working situations. Longo also could legally search Chris's house or car at any time without reason. But Chris filled out all the paperwork for his visits with his probation officer by himself, and the information on them, of course, was not accurate.
Yeah, and Longo never managed to take the time to check on the accuracy of what Chris was writing.
Not at all.
So at the first meeting, Chris wrote that he was the CEO of Final Touch Construction Cleaning and that he worked another job for the Ann Arbor News, delivering papers. Now, the supervision report asked if Chris owned a car, and he checked the yes box. And then he filled in the information for the Pontiac, Montana, which is the stolen car.
Yeah, nobody checked on that.
Of course, I guess at this point the Durango is also considered stolen too, because he stopped making lease payments.
Yeah, I don't know if that's considered stolen, but it definitely was in danger of being repossessed.
True.
So for 7 months, Chris did visit his probation officer, and he continued to fill out the supervision forms. He claimed that he owned the Montana each time that he was there, and he kept saying he was CEO of his own company. He wrote down his income as between $1,200 and $3,600 a month, and he did pay $300 towards his restitution and $1,200 in costs and supervision fees. But that's it, in a 7-month period, so that's well below what he had agreed to do.
Yes, it is. So then a new arrest warrant was filed with the prosecutor's office based on his Salient Tractor scheme. These guys at Salient Tractor are bulldogs. They kept going after Chris.
Well, because it's not like he just couldn't pay. He purposely bought that with a bad check and then resold the equipment on them to get more money. He knew no shame.
No.
So warrants for probationers like Chris are normally served during their probation visits. But for some reason, Eichland didn't know about the new arrest warrant, and the arrest was never made. So here's another thing where it's fallen through the cracks.
Right, then by the spring of 2001, this $100,000 credit line that his parents had put out, that was cut off. Chris had used up the line of money. So there's another $100,000 vanished.
Yeah, and he didn't even pay off a car or anything.
Nope. So Chris's parents had very little contact with their son and daughter-in-law and grandkids. So the couple at the same time seemed to be withdrawing from their usual social support systems. They were more and more sticking to themselves.
Right, yeah.
But by the same token, I mean, here he's shunned by the church. He's kicked out of there. They've cheated both sets of parents. Who wants to be around him?
These had to be such dark days for MaryJane, and I bet she was just in a deep, deep depression. She has 3 children under 4 years old, no job. She's living with this man who she can't trust at all. He's humiliated her in her church, with her siblings, with her parents. So she's really kind of lost her social support systems. I mean, where is she to go with this? If she doesn't leave him, she's kind of got to stay by his side. And then she's just kind of fucked in every direction. There's really nowhere for her to go. So my heart just breaks for her.
Yeah, you just want to say to her, MaryJane, leave the guy.
Well, of course you do, but it's not that simple.
Oh, of course not.
No. I mean, it had to be so hard for her. Plus, I'm sure he kept telling her he was going to change and he was going to fix things, and she wanted to believe it was true.
Oh, that was a constant refrain.
Absolutely. Then by June of 2001, there was a bench arrest warrant for Chris, which would compel him to go to court and set up repayment for this tractor scam. The warrant was served at the Longo's house, but by the time they got there, the Longo family was already gone. Chris and MaryJane had sold their house and moved away, taking all their belongings in a moving truck, as well as taking the Montana. Before the warrant, Chris had already set up with the title company to take over their house, and the deal he made should have left Chris and MaryJane with about $8,000. Now, you think that would have been enough to get an apartment, get a job, and start over, but that's not the way things went.
Not how Chris rolls. Nope.
But the day after the house sale went through, Chris opened a new bank account for the business, which wasn't an active business. Obviously, the business owed people a ton of money.
They did. MaryJane hadn't told anybody in her family that they were moving out of state. Her siblings knew a little bit of Chris's troubles with the law. Not the whole story. They were aware of the forged checks, and they knew that Chris had been disfellowshipped by the Jehovah's Witnesses. But they still thought it was unlike MaryJane to disappear without saying anything to her sister Sally, who was probably her best friend in the family.
Right, and Sally was also a Jehovah's Witness.
She was, so they're comfortable talking with each other.
Yeah, because some of the other siblings had left the witnesses.
Yeah, and we can't associate with them.
To a certain extent, yes. So the disappearance of the Longo family was worrisome, to say the least. Chris had decided to make one last visit to his probation officer on May 21st, and the PO still didn't know about the new arrest warrant that had been issued, even though it had been 6 months. But of course, Eklund didn't know that Chris had sold their house either, and that he'd packed up the family and left town. It was early June when Chris and MaryJane packed up all of their things into a trailer and headed to Toledo, Ohio. Chris leased an old warehouse for $2,000 a month. This 2-story building was brick and concrete. It was dirty, really not fit for people to be living in, especially with young children. And he promised to pay the landlord $14,000 down for the lease of the space. So why?
Yeah, and where's that money coming from?
Well, he had $8,000 from the sale of the house. I don't think he ever had any intention of paying the $14,000. He was quick to agree to things that he wouldn't follow through with.
True.
But why Chris rented this large warehouse rather than using his money to rent an affordable, appropriate living space for his family isn't really understood. But he did have a scam in mind to sell stolen property from that warehouse. Another thought is maybe he thought he'd be less likely to be found by the police if he wasn't living in a residential area where most people would live.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought.
But this was a horrible situation for MaryJane and the children. Just horrible. They were basically homeless.
They were. And we saw one of the documentaries we watched. This place was a hovel.
Yes, it was bad.
Uninhabitable.
Absolutely. And we're talking about babies.
Right. Now, Chris didn't wait very long before he got up to his old crimes again. He deposited a forged check for over $2,000 from another Michigan home building company, and then he was allowed to withdraw some of it in cash. Now, he did the same type of transaction with forged checks on both June 23rd and June 26th, so he's getting right back into business, isn't he?
Yeah.
So on June 11th, he missed his first probation officer visit, but his PO was still apparently unaware that the Longo house had been sold and that Chris and the family had left the state.
So wouldn't you think when he misses an appointment and doesn't answer his phone that someone would go over to the house? That he'd send the police to chat?
Well, yes, you would.
You would think so. But no.
Didn't happen.
As clever as Chris may have thought he was, he really didn't do anything to hide his identity from the banks he was defrauding. He used his own name. He also used his former home address in Michigan. And he also continued to drive that stolen Pontiac Montana with the vanity plate Kid Man. Didn't even change the plate.
Arrest me.
Yeah, but nobody did. It's just amazing to me. The detective who'd investigated and arrested Chris on his earlier forgeries learned that July that Chris had missed his June 11th and his July 2nd probation visits. So finally, Eklund went to a judge and a warrant was issued for Chris's arrest for violating his probation. But of course, they're not in Michigan anymore.
No, they aren't. So the state police went to Longo's old home address, found out that the Longos had sold it. And they had no forwarding address that the real estate officer, their neighbors, knew about. Chris's parents told the detectives that Chris had been illegally using their credit card. They had no way to reach Chris or MaryJane, but they did think that he may have moved to a renovated building somewhere in Toledo. So they had some inkling of what was going on.
Yeah, he must have mentioned something to them. Well, it turns out that MaryJane's sister Sally did have a cell phone number for MaryJane. She had actually spoken with MaryJane on the phone in July, and she'd gone to see her and the kids in Toledo twice. But she'd only met with MaryJane at public places, so she had no idea where the family was actually staying. And later in July, MaryJane's mother, Susan, called her on that cell phone. According to Susan, MaryJane told her that she didn't want the family to visit her and see the kids until Chris had a job and they had a nice place to live because she was embarrassed. That's so sad. And Susan started crying. She told her daughter she was really afraid she wasn't going to see her again, that something was going to happen to her. But MaryJane told her not to worry. But as we know now, Susan never did see her daughter MaryJane again.
And then in August, Chris had large items, like a trailer and a boat, in the warehouse where the family was living. This stuff turned out to be stolen property. Chris put an ad in a local newspaper, and a man called to buy a forklift from Chris. Now, this thing was worth about $30,000. Chris was asking only $5,000. So this guy gets suspicious, and he ends up calling the Toledo police.
So here you might think that Chris is going to be taken in, but he still gets away. The police went to the warehouse and saw the whole Longo family there. According to the police, though, Chris was very calm. He actually laughed and said he was starting his own business, and that's why he had the equipment. Then he promised to fax the title and the registration for the forklift to the police. But according to the police, MaryJane seemed indifferent to the whole situation. Now what's she going to do? She's not going to speak up at that point.
No, she's certainly not.
Plus, I truly believe that MaryJane was in a deep depression by now. I would have been, and I believe that she was.
Well, there's all the signs that point that way, right?
Well, yeah, the police said she just seemed very flat and indifferent. So I could totally see that.
So when the police did return to the warehouse, guess what? No family. No Longos. So all the equipment that had been left behind was confirmed to be stolen. And besides that equipment, the Longos had also left behind a lot of their personal items. Clothing, pictures, dishes, toys. And they really dumped a lot of stuff.
Well, they left in a hurry. And he did eventually get rid of the moving truck that they'd driven there, because it took a lot of gas.
Yep.
So it's just so upsetting to me that Chris wasn't arrested when they visited the warehouse. A simple background check would have revealed that he had 2 warrants from Ohio and 2 warrants from Michigan. Also, just one simple check of the VIN number on the Montana would have let them know that the van was stolen. Any one of these things could have gotten him arrested and could have saved Marianne and the children.
Could have. Didn't happen.
No, but Marianne's family would be very angry when they saw how MaryJane and her kids just kept falling through the cracks, and this was really allowed to happen to them. Of course, it's Chris's fault, but a lot of people let them down as well. So on August 27th, MaryJane did call and leave a message on her sister's phone, and she said that she wouldn't be able to meet her at a witness assembly that she'd agreed to meet her and their mother Susan at, because they'd moved again. But of course she didn't tell them that. She just left that message.
Yeah. And MaryJane's sister Penny filed a missing persons report with the Michigan State Police. Then in late September, Sally, Penny, and Susan drove to Toledo to talk to the Toledo police and to file a missing persons report there. So they were allowed to go into the abandoned warehouse where they saw many of the family's belongings in this just filthy building. Now, MaryJane's family expressed concern for the safety of MaryJane and the children, but they felt that the police were pretty dismissive of them.
Well, sure. They were basically saying that MaryJane was an adult and that she'd been there and didn't seem upset or in any distress when they were there. The Longos were actually in Sioux City in September, and they stayed there for 4 days in a campground. MaryJane wrote out 2 postcards to her sister Sally and her mother Susan, and Chris would mail them later. They eventually ended up in Oregon and made their way out to the Oregon coast. So when they got there, they rented out cheap rooms by the week, and Chris did get a job at a Starbucks. After a few weeks, he got a small raise and his hours were increased, and then he began looking for a better place to live. But he still wasn't looking for a reasonable or appropriate place.
No, he wasn't. And he still wasn't making anywhere near enough money to pay the bills.
No. And they really didn't reach out for help because it was part of the Jehovah's Witness belief not to get welfare or food stamps or any of the sort of things that might have helped the family, which is a shame because that's why those things are in place. We don't want people to go without, especially children. And she wasn't really free to just go out and work. She had these little kids to take care of.
She's got 3 kids under the age of 5.
Yeah.
Full-time job.
Absolutely. More than full-time.
Yeah. So in early November, Chris flew back to Sioux Falls because he had rented a storage locker there and stored some of their belongings. He wanted to pick up some things, mostly clothing and toys. And while he was there, he mailed out the postcards that MaryJane had written. The locker hadn't been paid for, so the owner had a padlock put on it. Chris got a lock-cutting tool, broke in and took some clothing and some other things that he thought he could pawn for money once he was back in Oregon.
Well, yeah, and then once he was back in Oregon, Chris copied a credit card number from a customer at Starbucks, and the customer had the last name Malarkey. Then he found a condo building called The Landing, which was very nice. The rent for a 1-bedroom was $1,200, way beyond their means. I mean, that was actually about the same as Chris's current monthly income. But that didn't stop him. He conned his way into it. On November 29th, he got the manager to rent him a 1-bedroom apartment with no money up front. I mean, besides that, a 1-bedroom is not ideal for a family of 5.
No. There's 3 little kids.
Yeah.
What are we going to do with them? Maybe we'll give them the bedroom, and we'll sleep on the couch in the living room.
Well, I mean, it's still better than what they had been doing. It was a step up, but they couldn't afford it.
No.
So the family moved into the Landing apartment and settled in there, even though Chris really had no idea how he was going to pay the rent. On Saturday, December 15th, Chris and MaryJane invited another couple over for dinner, and then they went out to see a movie. So they were trying to act normal. But things were not normal. On Monday morning, December 17th, Chris told the Landing manager that he was taking MaryJane, his sister-in-law, and the children to Portland to fly back to Michigan. Chris had to go to work at 2 p.m. that day, so if he'd actually made that drive, he wouldn't have made it back for his shift. But he was setting up his story to explain why his family wouldn't be around anymore.
Then on December 19th, a local Oregon man named Aubrey Van Mater found the body of a young boy face down in the water of Lint Slough. The child was wearing only underwear, so it wasn't likely that he had been the victim of any kind of boating accident. That Friday, a few days later, a drawing of the boy was shown on the local news. So the couple who had dinner with the family back on the 15th recognized the kid as Zachary Longo. So they tried to call the Longo family but didn't get an answer. Then they called the sheriff's department and told Lieutenant Ed Stallard about the family.
Right, so December 22nd, an officer from the Oregon State Police went to the Landing to try and find out more about the Longo family. The manager told the officer that the last time he saw Chris Longo was that Monday, December 17th, and Longo had told him then that he was taking his wife, children, and sister-in-law to the Portland airport. So the officer went to the Longo's room and found it vacant. All that was left behind was 2 stuffed animals in a closet. The Longos had also left 3 plastic bags in the complex's dumpster.
So that same day, a dive team searching for clues under the Slough Bridge found what looked like an empty brown sleeping bag in about 7 feet of water. Now, it turned out the sleeping bag was actually a comforter. And just minutes later, the body of a small girl was found. So a pillowcase had been tied around her ankle, and the pillowcase had a large rock in it to hold her body down under the water. This turned out to be Sadie Longo. So now the police knew that someone had tried to hide the bodies of 2 young children in the slough. 2 maids had noticed some of the Longos' belongings in a trash bin on Tuesday, December 18th, or Wednesday, December 19th. They weren't exactly positive. Now, the items included photo albums, baby books, baby clothing, and a wallet with MaryJane's ID. Not a good sign.
Well, this just makes my stomach turn. I mean, especially to think of their baby books. Oh, it's just heartbreaking.
A Starbucks co-worker told police that she had last seen Chris on the 19th of December. He had told the co-worker that he and his wife were having problems, and MaryJane was leaving him for a man who worked for Cable News Network. And he added that MaryJane and the children had returned to Michigan. So at this point, the prime suspects in the deaths of these 2 kids are Chris and his wife MaryJane. So the preliminary autopsy results showed that the kids had been alive when they were put into the water. So they had drowned after being weighted down with pillowcases tied to their ankles. What a horrible way to go.
It's unimaginable. So a rough timeline was put together. Monday, December 17th, Chris told the manager of the landing that he was taking his family to the airport. So this could be evidence of premeditation. Tuesday, December 18th, photos, clothes, diapers, and MaryJane's wallet with ID were found in a trash bin at a nearby motel. Wednesday, December 19th at 11:30 a.m., Zachary Longo's body was found. Wednesday, December 19th at noon, Chris told a co-worker that he and his wife were having problems, and then he said that she was leaving him for a CNN correspondent. So he had some kind of obsession with writers and cable news people. Friday, December 21st in the afternoon, the drawing of Zachary was broadcast on the television. And later that evening, the neighbors recognized Zachary and ended up calling the police. Then that Saturday morning, police went to the landing, and they found out that the Longos had left, vacated. Then Saturday afternoon, Sadie Longo's body was identified. Chris, MaryJane, and Madison Longo were also noted to be missing. Then Sunday, December 23rd, the FBI searched for information on the Longo family, and they found that there was a missing persons report filed for MaryJane Longo 3 months earlier by her family. So her family, the Baker family, learned about the murders of Sadie and Zachary. And they said there was no way that MaryJane would have harmed her kids. Say what you will, she was all about her kids. So they believed that she and Madison must be dead also. They also believed that if Chris was alive, he would have gone to Mexico. He'd traveled there several times before, and he really loved it there.
So the red Montana was put on a hot list of wanted vehicles throughout the state. Then it was connected to things that had happened on December 19th. A deputy had been called to the Town and Country Dodge dealership because they found that a new green Dodge Durango was missing, and a red Pontiac Montana had been left behind. So the Montana's plate holder was empty, but there was a visible outline of the word Kid Van from the vanity plate that had been removed. And when they checked the VIN on the Montana, they learned that it had been stolen almost 2 years earlier from a dealer in Ohio.
I would never have imagined that you could steal a car and keep it for 2 years.
Yeah, I know.
That's stunning. Police were searching for the Durango now, and the public was notified to look out for it too. And the DA wasn't ready to call Christian Longo a suspect yet. But it was definitely looking that way, and MaryJane's family was all about that.
They certainly were. So the Starbucks schedule showed that Chris had been off from work on Tuesday, December 18th, and that's the day before Zachary's body had been found. On Wednesday and Thursday, he worked from 5 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. Then on Friday, Chris went in to pick up his paycheck. But he didn't show up for his 3 o'clock to midnight shift Friday evening. So a team of divers finally searched the water off the dock at the landing on the same day that MaryJane's family flew into Oregon. And they kind of did this at the insistence of her family.
Oh, definitely. They were pushing for it. They had a pretty good idea of what had happened.
They sure did. And it only took a short time for the police, the searchers, divers, to find 2 suitcases in the shallow water. Larger suitcase had MaryJane's body, unclothed and folded up in it. And the second smaller suitcase had Madison's body. She wasn't quite 2 years old yet.
I just can't imagine what it's like to find something like that. I mean, you have to give credit to people that do these jobs because it has to be tough. It has to be so tough.
Wouldn't you be having nightmares forever?
I don't know how you deal with it. I would hope that you're given therapy because it just is terrible to even imagine how you can live seeing that. But now the police believe that Christian Longo was likely alive and had fled to Mexico, as MaryJane's family had said. So they're finally giving some credit to MaryJane's family because they're the ones that kind of knew what had happened. They put it together.
They were the ones, that's right.
So the timeline of Chris's actions to flee Oregon began on December 21st, the Friday, after he picked up his paycheck at Starbucks. Zachary's body had been found on Wednesday, but it wasn't positively identified until that Saturday. MaryJane and Madison weren't found until the next week. So he had just over $200 and the stolen Dodge Durango at that time. He drove to San Francisco and arrived on Saturday. This was the day when 3-year-old Sadie's body was found. Chris spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in a hostel in San Francisco, and the day after Christmas he went to a Kinko's copy store and used a computer there. He bought a plane ticket to Cancun, Mexico using the credit card information that he'd copied from the Starbucks customer named Malarkey, and that cost $750. Then he left the Durango in the long-term parking garage and boarded the plane.
So the flight had a stop in Dallas. Chris was able to board a second flight there also, and he landed in Cancun on December 28th. And as he passed through immigration, he used his real name and declared that he was not wanted for any crimes in the U.S. Then he was covered on America's Most Wanted, and warrants were issued for his arrest. January 5th, 2002, a memorial service was held for MaryJane, Madison, Sadie, and Zachary Longo. Then on January 6, 2002, 2 San Francisco police officers found the missing Durango in the airport garage. They also found a laptop computer and the kid van license plate inside the Durango. So it was towed away to be processed. January 11th, the FBI learned about the airline ticket that Chris had bought after the credit card owner Malarkey found out about the charge and called and complained about it. So they tracked that down. Longo was put on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and a $50,000 reward was offered for information leading to his capture.
Yeah, Longo was able to book a room at a hostel for a week in Cancun. But some people from Argentina reported that they had money missing, and it was believed that Chris, who was going by the name Mike, was responsible. He denied it, but he was still kicked out. Some English tourists staying near Longo decided to go to the coastal city of Tulum, about an hour from Cancun, where there was some good scuba diving, and Longo followed them there. While he was on the bus, he met German photojournalist Janina, and Longo decided at that point to use the name of New York Times journalist Michael Finkel. Janina believed Longo's stories and his false identity, and eventually they had a friendship and even a romance, and they started a working partnership as well. Longo and Janina stayed together in an inexpensive campground not far from Tulum, with grass huts for housing. There was nightlife and internet within walking distance, and Longo had a good time there. He and Janina began researching and taking photos there, and he told her they might be able to sell their work to magazine publishers. And she believed him. So he could be quite convincing. According to people who knew Longo there as Michael Finkel, he was likable and fun to be around. No one suspected that he was lying, but then a Montreal woman returned from her vacation in Cancun to see the man she had known as Mike on the news as Christian Longo, a man wanted for the murders of his family.
Yeah, so after the TV show aired on America's Most Wanted, the woman called the FBI and told agents that she had seen Christian Longo before she left Mexico. Then a Mexican tour guide called to say that he had seen Christian Longo on January 13th. So officers went to the campground where he was staying and arrested him. And he admitted that he was Christian Longo. Now, he didn't confess to anything at first, but he agreed to return to the United States, primarily so that he didn't have to be held in a Mexican jail.
So the journalist Michael Finkel had lost his job with the New York Times. That was after he had made up an individual in one of his stories, who was actually a composite of several people. And after he heard about Longo using his identity in Mexico, he decided to contact Longo in jail, thinking there's probably a story there. So these two began writing to each other and then talking, and for a while Finkel found Longo quite sympathetic and nice, and hoped that he was innocent.
Now, once he's back in the United States, he pled guilty to the murders of MaryJane and Madison, and not guilty to the murders of Zachary and Sadie. He took the stand during his 2003 trial, and during his testimony, he claimed that MaryJane had killed Zachary and Sadie, disposed of their bodies, and she also had attempted to kill Madison. When Longo came home and he had found 2 of his children gone and the third severely injured, he strangled MaryJane. He said that he then strangled Madison because she was so far gone, it was kind of a mercy killing.
So this is very Chris Watts-ish, isn't it?
It is.
And it's really the most despicable thing you can do. I mean, he's murdered his wife, and now he wants to destroy her memory, this woman who loved her children, and her main wish in life was to be a good mother. It's heinous. It just makes him the scum of the earth. And fortunately, the jury didn't believe him either.
Yeah, they just took a little over 4 hours to reach their verdict. So he was convicted of 7 counts of murder. 2 counts for the murder of each child, because they're kids, and 1 count for MaryJane. And he was sentenced to death.
Yeah, now Michael Finkel wrote a book about his experiences with Longo, and it was published in 2005. It's called True Story. In 2009, Longo contacted Finkel again from death row, and he told him he was ready to tell the whole truth. Then he said that he had killed his entire family, first strangling MaryJane during sex, and then throwing his children into the water while they were still alive. Then he added that he was ready to be executed, and that he wanted to donate his body to science after his death. But there are actually 2 books that we know of about this case. True Story by Michael Finkel, which was also made into a movie, and Love Daddy by Carlton Smith. 48 Hours also covered this case in an episode titled The Pretender. Is there any other sources that you can think of?
No sources, but I think the only other thing to say is that he is still on death row. Oregon's put a moratorium on killing prisoners.
Right, and I think they hadn't sent anyone to death since the 60s anyway.
Right. So the likelihood is that he's not going to be executed, that he's going to live the rest of his life in prison.
Yeah.
Okay, let's plug the podcast a little bit, girl.
Okay, first of all, our loyal early Tie Grabber members who joined at the $2 and $3 level, we sent you an email with a special link so that you can resubscribe and keep your original lower subscription price. So I think most people have gone ahead and done that, but I just wanted to give one more reminder. And we actually released the September TCB Premium episode a little over a week back, and that was about Pastor A.B. Shermer, who was charged with killing 2 wives. And Dick was in charge of writing the title for this one. It's called A Wolf in Shepherd's Clothing, so good work on that, Dick. And it was definitely an eye-opening case to research, and we had a great discussion about it. If you'd like to join and get access to premium podcasts, just visit tiegrabber.com and click on the gold subscribe button. You can't miss it. As soon as you subscribe, you get access to all 30-something, maybe close to 40 now, premium episodes. And you have the option to pay monthly, quarterly, or annually, and to choose your own welcome gift that I'll send to you as a personal thank you for your support. Another thing, if you visit our new website, I'd like to suggest you check out our shop. Now we have just about everything you could want to put our logos on available there with our collaboration with TeePublic. Plus, TeePublic has a lot of sales, so you can usually get a really good deal. I mean, like 30-40% off sometimes.
Yeah, I got a Tie Grabber t-shirt for, $12 or something. It's next to nothing.
It's a bargain.
Now we're into everyone's favorite section, feedback. And true to what I've been doing for the last few weeks, I've got one voicemail and 2 emails. So the voicemail that we're going to play today is from Carrie, and she has a case suggestion and a beer suggestion.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Carrie from Norman, Oklahoma, and I just wanted to leave a voicemail and let you know how much I love your podcast. I listen to it every week. Can't wait for it to come out. I've actually been listening to it for over 3 years now. And I have a beer suggestion and a case suggestion. My beer suggestion is the Chalk Beer in Krebs, Oklahoma. It's pretty famous and should be easy to get in New Mexico. And my case suggestion is the Sirloin Stockade murders that happened in Oklahoma by a man named Roger Dale Stafford in the 70s. And I think it would be a great one for you guys to cover. Can't wait to hear it.
Thanks, Carrie. Very succinct.
She was. I mean, the case is a very interesting one. This guy was a convicted spree killer and serial killer, and he was actually executed for the murders that he committed. He killed the Lawrence family and 6 employees of a Sirloin Stockade restaurant in Oklahoma. Now, he never acknowledged his guilt, but his wife, Verna, implicated him in a total of actually 34 murders in 7 different states.
Yikes.
Prolific.
Awful.
So he began his killing spree in 1974 when he killed 21-year-old Jimmy Earl Berry, who was a student at the University of North Alabama. Berry was shot 4 times, and whoever killed him robbed the restaurant of $1,400. Now, this crime remained unsolved until 4 years after the incident, when Stafford and his brother Harold were implicated by his wife Verna. He was never prosecuted for Berry's murder because of the Oklahoma murder convictions. I'll have to do some more research as to why that happened. I mean,
well, he was put to death, so I guess.
Oh, I guess that would be a reason not to prosecute him.
Yeah, that
but
might be.
But if he was still on death row, why wouldn't you charge him?
Yeah, I don't know.
So and then he continued with his murder spree with Verna and his brother Harold. In June of 1978, they flagged down the Lawrence family and shot the husband, the wife, and their son. And then 3 weeks later, he was robbing the Sirloin Stockade restaurant in Oklahoma City, and he killed 6 people, 6 employees of the restaurant.
Holy shit, that's a lot of people at a steak place. Wow.
Yeah.
So he was kind of a serial killer and a mass killer.
He was.
And this must have been a while back. What, the 70s?
In the 70s, yeah.
Okay. All right.
So I think we'll look at that. I guess Carrie's from Norman, so she must be a Sooner fan. I don't think you're allowed to live in Norman unless you like the Sooners. Her beer suggestion, I've actually never had any chalk beers, so I'll have to start looking for them.
Let's seek those out.
We'll seek them out. Thanks, Carrie.
So I have a case suggestion from Julia. Julia's from Perth, Western Australia. I'm absolutely obsessed with your podcast and can't wait for every new one. I have an episode suggestion, very gruesome and horrible, but I would like to hear your take on this case. John Sharp, a New Zealand man, claimed that his pregnant wife Anna had taken their daughter Gracie and left him. However, he was later found to have killed Anna with a spear gun, and he later did the same to little Gracie. He buried their bodies in the local rubbish tip. That must be an Australian term. Excellent police work eventually found the bodies, and John was found guilty of their murder. Okay, so the Sharp family murders in March of 2004. It was a double murder. John Sharp killed his wife Anna, who was pregnant with their son, and also his 20-month-old daughter Gracie. This was in the Melbourne suburb of Mornington. For his part, he was generally known as the Spear Gun Killer, or the Mornington Monster. Sharp repeatedly fired a spear gun into the heads of his victims, later exhumed the body of his wife from a shallow grave, dismembered her, and then disposed of her body in a landfill. Claiming his innocence, he later appeared in emotional interviews on TV, seeking information on his family's whereabouts. Sharp eventually confessed to the murders and was sentenced in 2005 to 2 terms of life in prison with no parole. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting case. We haven't done anything from Australia in a while.
We haven't done an Australia case for a while. The other thing is that the murder weapon.
Oh, it's just horrific.
So I thought that might be interesting to look into.
So a spear gun, that's like something you'd use underwater?
Yeah.
Oh, that's dreadful.
No kidding.
Wow, he was a real sicko. That was his family he did that to.
His pregnant wife and his daughter.
Yeah. Okay, we have one more case suggestion. Dick, why don't you read it?
This is from Marilyn. She says, how about discussing the case of Joshua Jenkins, who murdered his parents, grandparents, and sister? He was an adopted child, and this case took place in the 1990s. So this is in California and Los Angeles. He confessed to killing 5 members of his family and was sentenced to 112 years to life in a state prison. He had recently been placed in the Vista Del Mar School in Los Angeles, which is a school for emotionally troubled teenagers. He hacked and knifed his parents, grandparents, and sister to death in their condominium in February of 1996. The jury rejected his attorney's assertions that he was insane. But he apparently killed his family because he was pissed off at them for sending him to this school for kids with special needs.
So he had serious rage issues.
He certainly did.
Yeah, he set fire to the condominium before he left in the family car.
Yeah.
So that poor family, I mean, obviously they were trying to help him out, trying to get him help, and then this happens. And there's really, I mean, what can really be done to prevent something like that? It's just a horrible thing. So sad.
It is.
Yeah. Well, that's another one that we will definitely look into.
So we'll check that one too.
So thank you, Marilyn.
Thanks.
All right, that wraps it up for today, Dickie.
Okay, we've almost finished the second bottle of blueberry ale. Anybody else want some?
I do. We'll see everybody next time at the Quiet End. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.